Ladies and gentlemen, welcome to Development Discourse, where we ideate for Africa's development. My name is Patrick Okigbo, Founding Partner of Nextier. Nextier is a multi-competency advisory firm focused on solving Africa's complex development challenges. Africa's economic potential is significant, but underutilized. Nigeria, the largest economy on the continent, has the potential to lead the way towards a more prosperous continent. My guest today insists that Nigeria can achieve $1 trillion economy within a decade. Is this a prayer or an achievable goal? What is the how to this? Jude Uzonwanne is the author of The First Trillion, Disbelief, Arbitrage, and the Nigerian Dream. Jude primarily works as a corporate development advisor to African governments and Africa-focused investors and companies. An entrepreneur in spirit, Jude has helped found and grow several companies across multiple sectors, including Sea Trade Africa, SocketWorks, it's a technology company, and Nisal PLC. And I think Nisal is going to come up a lot in our conversations today. Prior to his current role, Jude held very senior roles at institutions such as 54 Gene Inc. in the US, ZS, in EY, Ernst & Young, Bain & Company, Dalberg, the Gates Foundation, and the Central Bank of Nigeria. Jude began his career as a strategy consultant at Monitor Group. It's now Monitor Deloitte, I think. Jude was an honors graduate at Swarthmore College in economics and political science. His early education was at Aberdeen Primary School, Emmanuel College, IS International School Ibadan, and United World College of the American West. Jude, welcome.
Thank you very much, Patrick. Pleasure to be with you.
We have a whole lot to unpack, but let's start from the very beginning. I mean, writing a book is a bit of a labor of love, right? Mm-hmm. So what motivated you to write this book? The First Trillion, I hope you can see it. I read it on, no, okay, I guess you can see it now. Yes. I read it on Kindle. The First Trillion, Disbelief, Arbitrage, and the Nigerian Dream. What was the inspiration behind writing this book?
So in many respects, it was driven by a desire to unpack Nigeria, to explain Nigeria to both domestic and foreign audiences, as well as just a burning desire to really just kind of straighten a bunch of things in my own head. So often when you talk about Nigeria's potential, people don't believe it. And they say, no, it's like the way people used to talk about Brazil. It's a country of the future. And so over the years, as I encountered Nigeria both as a person and as a professional, there were so many discontinuities that I said, somehow I have got to explain this. I couldn't quite fathom how, when you look at your own personal experience and you look at the official statistics and you look at how outsiders and Nigeria talk about Nigeria, there's too many gaps. So I said, okay, let me try and bring this all together. I think I wrote the first draft of the book sometimes in about the year 2000. And then over time, it just kept on evolving. Okay. It's taken many forms. At some point, it became a book about the transformation of African economies. Then I kind of pulled it back in again to Nigeria. And finally, last winter, I said to my family, I'm going to lock myself away for 2 weeks and finish this. And I did.
Yeah.
And there we go.
Congratulations. So, I mean, maybe you can speak to the book's central thesis, yes. And then we can take it from there.
Mm-hmm. And I think the central thesis is that Nigeria can be a very wealthy country, both at the absolute level and in terms of on a per capita basis for its own citizens. And wealth, of course, means a range of things in terms of your ability to walk down the street safely, income in your pocket, the possibility that your kids will have a better future than you, et cetera, et cetera. Typically, finance and econ people tend to reduce wealth to per capita GDP, which is a good proxy. But we also know that there are a lot of other elements around it. But the central idea of the book is building wealth in Nigeria is not that hard. And governing Nigeria, I take exception to President Buhari, former President Buhari's view. Governing Nigeria is not that hard if you have the right set of not just intentions, but you make the right set of choices. So I'll give you a very practical example. I've been coming to Muritala Mohammed Airport for the last 30 years or so, since I first went to boarding school in the US in 1992. And it's absolutely astonishing that the same problem has persisted in the arrival hall for going on almost 40 years now. And what's that problem? It's, there's a term that is often used called operations research to encapsulate this problem, which is, the number of flights that are landing on any given night. It's not like flights suddenly show up from anywhere. There's a specified count of flights, the number of passengers, and then you can basically do the basic arithmetic and say, if it takes me 5 minutes to process one passenger, first you encounter the DSS officer who checks whether you're on the watch list or not. And then second, you go to the immigration officer who checks your visa or checks your passport. So estimate the time it takes for step 1 and step 2. If it's 4 minutes or 5 minutes, divide the number of passengers by that time. And then you can get a very quick sense of the number of officers you need present to process passengers. So if you said to yourself, nobody should spend more than 15 minutes clearing immigration, you can do the math of the number of officers required. And that to me is essentially the problem description in Nigeria. Very few government officials have done the math of what does it take to actually solve that problem at Muritala Airport, talk less of the whole country. And as a result, we throw out large numbers that may sound amazing and may sound like government is offering generosity and palliatives, to use the term of the day. But in reality, it's actually hiding the fact that no one really has taken the steps to grasp the nature of the problem. So if you said to yourself, I don't want to necessarily spank anybody, but if you recall, for the last couple of months, President Tinubu and a number of his ministers have repeated the utter nonsense that the economy will become $1 trillion economy by 2026. That, and I've said privately to officials that not only does that show the ignorance of the administration in terms of basic growth and arithmetic, it also shows that there's no one inside the government saying you are basically peddling nonsense. So it was one of the first things we learned in undergraduate economics, is a simple piece of calculation. If you want to figure out how quickly an economy will double, divide 70.
72, there's 2 rule.
Exactly, by the number of years that, or the growth rate you have in mind. And the output is the time it will take to double. So 72 divided by 10 is 7.2. And so that means if you're growing the economy at 10% per annum, you will double income in 7.2 years. So in order for you to double income in 2 years, you need to grow the economy by about 35% per annum.
30%, correct.
Exactly, which is mathematically impossible.
But Jude, it brings me to a section of your book where I had a bit of a challenge, though.
Yes.
And if you permit me to just read that section, it can tie back to the answer you're providing. So earlier on in the book, you said it's January 2027. And the Nigerian household is on the mend. Breadwinners are at work again. The result of millions of new jobs in communities across the country. Millions of children are receiving modern, innovation-enabling education in classrooms. Life expectancy is rising, driven by new annual wellness and disease prevention programs targeted at heart diseases, stroke, diabetes, and cancer. Fathers and mothers stroll at night, and I like this part, taking comfort in each other's presence and marveling at the buzz in well-lit streets, police officers from multiple jurisdictions, federal and state, and you go on and on and on, right? I didn't want this to stop. But then I remembered, you're painting a picture of what could be, right? You published the book in 2023, after the elections. You understand Nigeria, Jude. You study Nigeria, you understand the challenges. Yet your crystal ball conjured up this picture for 2027. I'd like to hear, what led you to believe that this is possible and that we should take this seriously?
Yeah. So it's an aspirational statement, and I deliberately, just one quick correction. So the book finally was published January 4th or 5th, 2024. So barely.
Okay, 24. Okay.
Yeah. And so by putting the dateline in 2027 and saying, and the lead up to that part is to say that in the first half, by June of 2024, effectively the government came around, and from a series of crises, which was obvious to me was coming, they finally, as Americans would put it, they had their come to Jesus moment.
Correct.
And sat down and said, we are now going to take the bull by the horn and fix this problem. And there were really three fundamental sets of choices that had to be made. So in many respects, that paragraph, that opening chapter, was a letter to the government and people of Nigeria to say, this is not impossible. This is doable. This is, I may have my political differences with the ruling party, but this is a problem that we think we can all solve together. But it requires uncontested leadership from the top of the system to say, we are going to fix this problem. And in some respects, there seems to be some members of the National Assembly who are stumbling towards that answer. Occasionally, we get a hint from the presidency via executive orders or comments that they may be stumbling towards that answer. But let's be absolutely clear. What's required to start off with is law and order. So first, before you can have any further conversations about job creation, about investment inflows, about the productivity of labor or inflow of capital, you have to start with what in the book I refer to as the Safe Nigeria Act, which is an omnibus piece of legislation that basically says, look, we need to get away from one of the big fundamental lies that is at the heart of Nigeria, which is that the federal system alone, or we call it a federal system, but it's actually a unitary system, can solve all of our problems. And in the book, I've pointed to examples where the federal cabinet is making decisions on projects that are local. So I grew up in Ibadan. And for those who know Ibadan, we have a water system called Oba Dam that was the source of water supply for the university. Periodically, you've seen things like Oba Dam, the reconstruction of Oba Dam, and similar projects around the country being the focus of attention of the federal cabinet. That is absolutely mad, quite just to put it bluntly. And the things that the Safe Nigeria Act is supposed to do is to devolve that authority back to where it belongs, which is the community. University of Ibadan, University of Nsukka, of Nigeria and Nsukka, University, Ahmadu Bello University should be able to have its own police force that is composed of people who live in that community, who understand the dynamics and who can help safeguard that society. Once you pass laws that permit law and order to now become the responsibility of the local community, that allows state police, local government police, city police, university police, etc., etc., etc. Whoever wants policing authority can now apply to a new independent federal board that will give that authority, sanctify it, etc. And then the Nigerian police force itself becomes a federal police force that can perform a range of functions, everything from federal crimes to anti-fraud, etc. You simply establish jurisdictional boundaries based on law. Once you fix that basic problem, then a lot of growth will come from simply taking away the threat of loss of life and property. So today, a lot of farmers cannot go to their farms.
Sure.
Whether it's in Ibadan, whether it's in on the outskirts of Ilorin, whether it's in Maiduguri or in Niger State, roughly about a third of Niger State is under the control of ISWAP/Boko Haram. Niger, Benue, Plateau are the three most important states when it comes to food production. So you cannot say that you expect a turnaround in food production or agriculture's contribution to GDP, which is still roughly about 24, 25%, when your farmers cannot go to the farm.
Exactly.
So you've effectively constrained roughly a quarter of your GDP because you have security problems. And then in urban areas, you have kidnapping is a problem. On your interstate highways, kidnapping is a problem. So until you start with fixing the basic breakdown of law and order that we have today, you cannot have a productive conversation about investments, jobs, and income growth.
And I agree with you. And one of the things I found really interesting about the book is how you situated the solution on a tripod, right? And the tripod of local economic advantages, and a significant, most of your discussions focused a lot on a significant focus on the local community, a transformed security system, which you have spoken about now, and a reinforced education system that powers an innovation-driven economy. So my question is, can you explain to us why this focus on local is critical? And then also talk a bit about how you defined education here, that it's not just education for education's sake, but really an education that empowers innovation.
Absolutely. So the importance of local really comes from a fairly basic fact, which is when any of us as economic participants, when you go down the street to buy bread or to buy akara, or to go to your dry cleaners or the market, your economic activity is probably within a radius of 10 to 20 kilometers of your residence. And so all of those folks in that perimeter are also shaping what happens, the dynamics. At most, people are going maybe 50 kilometers beyond. So in that respect, all the decisions that will shape your behavior as a consumer, as an investor, or as an entrepreneur will be things that are immediately applicable within your local community. So if today I have electricity in my small corner of town, then that means I probably would say, let me save up, buy a refrigerator. And then, 2 weeks after I bought that refrigerator, I'll probably go to the local market and buy more fish than I probably have bought in the last decade or 2 decades, because I have no fear that that fish will go bad. So I begin to spend a little bit more money than I typically would have. And it's that accelerated velocity of money, to use the fancy econ term. And me beginning to dip into my savings. It is putting that capital back into the economy that begins to drive gains in productivity and ultimately wealth. But so decisions that are made locally can have a pretty radical impact fairly quickly, simply because the money is there, it's seen, and it has an impact. It's not that federal money does not have an impact. Federal money absolutely does, if it is spent doing things that are productive. So the federal government can budget 100 billion for road reconstruction. But if 90% of that money doesn't make it back into the local economy, then you have a real problem.
Exactly.
And that's really the fundamental issue here. But the bigger question is, who's accountable for making sure we have a clear picture of what's happening at the local government? So today, I don't care what most Nigerian governors would say, but most of them are violating the constitution when it comes to local government autonomy. We've talked through this issue back and forth for decades. And quite frankly, a bunch of them are just, they really have captured the local governments and captured their financial flows. The local governments should have money come to them directly from the federal government, but that is in the current system. The real reform is a different system where local governments actually are generating their own revenue. They take it in and they pay some contributory taxes to maintain the center. That's really where the real change ought to come from. But as we are today, in the absence of accountability for what happens at the local government, then you really don't see any change. Their budgets disappear, their officials have no decision rights, and because most of them are simply hand-picked appointees of the state government, and they're there to enable the theft of local government money.
So two stories maybe,
Yes.
and then a question. So the first one is from Yuan Ang's book on how China escaped the poverty trap.
Yes.
So essentially, the central government sets the red lines, for stability, etc.
Yep.
But then let loose the energies in the local communities.
Yes.
And there's competition. The better you do, the more you get, etc. Second example, I was looking at the MBS multidimensional poverty numbers, and the most recent one shows that poverty in the Southeast spiked from about 20-something% 3-4 years ago to about 50-something% this time, right? And you can almost draw a straight line to the rise of IPOB and the fact that people no longer come home and they can't spend money in those local economies. Third and final, story is, if the local government is supposed to be the engine, and I think you've already alluded to this, the failure of the state governments giving them their monies, and ensuring that it's the people's representatives that run those local economies, is part of the reasons why we can't grow, right? So if we know all of this, how do we get the governors, the president, the people at, the political elite to see that we're really shooting ourselves in the head this time by stopping the local government engine from cranking? How do we do that?
How do you convince a man he's drunk? I mean, so short of tossing them into a cooling off chamber, you keep rationalizing to them, you keep explaining to them, but 8 out of 10 times they're not prepared to listen. So to me, our current constitutional system, you have to dismantle it. And here's the reason why. Again, you go back to the local level. So if you take a city like Enugu or Ibadan or Kano, the city itself is split into multiple local government areas in most cases. And most of so set aside the fact that the LGA mechanism is dysfunctional, most of those chairmen are not talking to each other, nor the council members talking to each other. But in reality, as an investor, in most normal circumstances, when I say I want to build a plant for a car manufacturing or to manufacture tomato paste or water bottles, it's usually, that decision is shaped by the circumstances I'm looking at in that local community. So are the roads good? If I'm going to invest in Enugu, I really don't care about the quality of roads in Ibadan. If I'm investing in Enugu, I don't care about policing or security or the presence of streetlights or where my workers will come from the other side of the country. The reality is that all the parameters that will shape my decision-making are there locally. And again, usually within a 20 to 50 kilometer radius. do the schools produce the right talent I need? Are the streets safe? Are police officers there? Are raw materials proximate to where I want my plant to be? And this is one of the myths that Nigeria has built its industrial infrastructure on, is that you can truck raw materials 1,000 kilometers to go to a factory. Right off the bat, any sensible investor would tell you that the logistics cost would immediately kill your margins. So set aside whether the raw material itself needs to be processed quickly. So things like cassava, once you harvest cassava, you have to process it within 24 hours or it will become unusable for certain output. So if you have a factory that is 500 kilometers from where the cassava is grown, you failed even before you started. So an investor making the decision to put jobs into a specific location is really optimizing for the capabilities and the assets in that location.
I understand the argument, Jude. My question is, how do we get the political elite to see this? And I think there's a unique opportunity here. If you remember back in when OBJ's presidency, right? Part of the challenges he had with Bola Tinubu as governor of Lagos was that Tinubu wanted to move away from the local government delineations and set up his own, I forget what he called it, but like enterprise. Correct. Yeah. I think here's an opportunity, right? Yeah. So what Alex Otti is trying to do in Abia, he's just appointed a mayor for Aba, right?
Yes.
Udabala, who's one of the wealthiest Igbo men, right? And he makes him mayor. I wish he was he was through an election, but we'll take what we have. He was appointed, and his mayoralty spans a number of local governments, because they're thinking here business, right? They're thinking enterprise. So I can see a Bola Tinubu as president who understands it. I can see some governors like an Alex Otti who understands it. Is there a sequence of activities that gets them to move in that direction?
Absolutely. And I mean, the simplest thing to do is through the Constitution amendment process. Now, we can debate whether the whole Constitution has to be junked and you go back to the 1963 Constitution and you update elements of it. But
which you proposed in the book, by the way.
Exactly. Which, so if you went down that path, then you get rid of the local government system and you say, literally, cities, towns, and villages, when you drive into an American city or town, you usually will see a sign saying incorporated and the date.
Yeah.
Basically, Ibadan can now reclassify itself, define its own boundaries, and say Ibadan incorporated, 1545, or if everybody wants to be on the same page, everybody reincorporates as of 2024. But then, yes, that city elects a mayor and a council, probably no more than 10 to 15 councillors, and they are responsible for job growth in Ibadan. They're responsible for healthcare, for fire departments, for utilities, including electricity and water. And by the way, they should own assets that are cash generating. So the airport in Enugu should belong to Enugu City and let them collect revenues on it. The federal government has no business owning that airport. So effectively, you push both wealth creation as well as accountability into the local government. Yes, it reduces the powers of the state and the presidency. And quite frankly, I think some realization is beginning to come into the system, because I'm now hearing everybody saying, oh, we ought to go back to a parliamentary system. Set aside the hypocrisy of folks who were governors and ministers for the last 16 years, who are now championing parliamentary system. We'll forgive them for that intellectual misstep. But the truth is, when you come as a politician from your local community and you are accountable to your local community and you are elected in a relatively clean election, you don't need to be accountable to the people on the other side of the country. it's essentially charity will begin at home. And if people get tired of you, they'll throw you out in the next by-election.
So Jude, and this is something that kept, going through my mind as I read the book. My friend, or our friend, Osita Chidoka, there's something he calls work avoidance, right? So he claims that when Nigerians don't want to work or solve a problem, they create a new bureaucracy, or they hang on to something and say, unless we do this, I hear a bit of that here. So I listened to your description of this new city model, and I don't see what is fundamentally different between that and the local government model we have today. Yeah. I also listen to people when they argue we must go, we must go back to the 1963 Constitution. We can't make it on the 1999 Constitution. And again, Osita would argue, and I agree, have we explored all the powers, we have in these constitutions, and, and we've gotten up to a point where we can go no further unless we change them. So how do you respond to this pushback that maybe this is all work avoidance?
Yeah. So it is an interesting view. I don't think we avoid. Personally, I'm not avoiding work. I love work, and but I am cognizant of the fact that sometimes the challenge is not necessarily the system; it's sometimes the people, and sometimes you have a challenge of both. So exactly to your opening comments. How do you design a system that is reflective of the flaws we have found in ourselves? As Shakespeare reminds us, it's not in the stars, but in ourselves. So if I know that there is a weakness, can I use institutional redesign to balance for that weakness?
Correct.
Yes, today, the presidential system of governance presupposes the good intentions of the occupants of the office. So one of the things I recall, again, from my undergraduate years, was we used in our public economics seminar, we used a book called Memos to the President that describes all the memos, actually not describes, it contains all the memos that were written to incoming United States presidents over a course of about 45 years, that lays out all the issues and the recommendations on how to problem solve them. So you were briefed, and the transition mechanism was also there to guide you and your incoming staff. We've experimented with similar things in Nigeria, but as in all things Nigerian, we take a little bit of what we like, but we don't go to the end of the road. So if we truly emulated the American system of governance, the way it's designed, we should not be having these problems, because today in the United States, they don't have, they're counties, but county governments are still relatively, it's almost a bit of a nomenclature relative to the authority of the mayors of cities. So as much as I don't want to go through another constitutional song and dance, I recognize that we have to manage for the institution, for essentially the personal failings we've seen. And it's interesting, the counterfactual is, I've been told in a discussion that when I was chief executive of NICEL, I made a mistake in how I constructed what eventually became NICEL, that the authorities we granted the chief executive officer and his or her team in the MEMAT of the company were excessive. So the construction of NICEL was, at that time, so just a quick background, NICEL was essentially an attempt by the Central Bank of Nigeria and under Lamido Sanusi and the Bankers Committee to figure out a way to make agriculture a viable sector of the economy again. At that time, banks were lending less than 1% of their loan volume to agriculture. And Governor Sanusi and the bank CEO said, we have to change this because we need to create jobs, etc. Again, remember the context. God rest his soul. The late President Yar'Adua at that time was ill, and there was not much in the way of policy leadership coming from his cabinet because of all the competing tensions inside. So essentially, central bank took on this responsibility amongst many other responsibilities. And that's really where the seed for the idea that central bank became this giant policy maker in the system outside of monetary policy came from, So we reflected that muscular ambition in the memmot of NICEL and said it could trade, it could lend, it could buy and do all sorts of things. And it was really because of practical issues. So, for example, we wanted to help drive the production of rice. And we realized we needed about 100,000 tons of rice seeds to really transform rice production in Nigeria. But we could only find about 1,000. And in order to that, even that 1,000, Ivana Osage and I and my team, we had to look all over West Africa to find that. So we went back to the governor and said, can we basically fund the production of rice seeds in order to fix this problem? That in the absence of that, Nigeria would never produce enough rice to feed itself. And we know what the demand is. It's roughly about 10 to 12 million tons of rice per annum. Unfortunately, the bank said no. Until today, despite the fantasy that the Buhari administration and Governor Emefiele put out about rice pyramids, we don't produce enough rice because of that fundamental problem, which is you don't have enough seeds to begin with. So it was that kind of problem-solving intent that drove that institutional design. Now, my successor then used that authority to basically go wild and enrich himself and commit all sorts of crimes. And so you now are forced to then reflect and say, if you give too much authority, people can go wild, which is essentially our presidential system today. But you have to then consider how much of that authority do you take back and where do you redistribute it? And that's why, for me, my belief after 20, 30 years of thinking about this problem, I think you ought to go back to the 63 Constitution. You ask states to voluntarily merge into each other. Those who don't want to merge, that's okay. They can have their own regional premiers, but you take away a lot of federal power that has been awfully abused, and you push it back as far down into the system as you possibly can.
So I'm happy you brought up NICEL, because it's a project. I mean, when you were running it, we spent many evenings talking about the program, etc. But I saw in the book, that you proposed something that looked eerily similar to NICEL. You proposed setting up an enterprise Nigeria, that would be led by a minister of state from the Federal Ministry of Industry, Trade and Investment. Amongst many things it will do, it will have about ₦1 trillion that it can co-invest with other private investors in, seed capital, Series A funding. Sounded very much like NICEL 2.0, but now on a grander scale. And I wonder, because you've had some time to reflect on NICEL, reflect on many other things we try to do, including a lot of the development intervention funds that CBN put out there. Share with me, the actual design of this enterprise Nigeria, because I have too many issues with it.
Yes. No, so enterprise Nigeria again reflects a desire to allow local governments, cities, etc., to do their own thing, but to have a backstop to support them. So Enterprise Nigeria is really a desire to refocus the intervention efforts of the federal government into a business-driven mechanism. So many moons ago in my earlier career, when I was with Monitor, we spent a lot of time. At that time, Monitor was very focused, and it still is. The teams are still in place on something the term we used back then was country competitiveness. And this all grew out of the work of one of the founders of Monitor, Michael Porter. So I remember I think it was my second or third week at Monitor, Michael Porter came to the office in Cambridge, Massachusetts. He had just published his book, The Competitiveness of Nations, and took us through the training, seminars, etc. And we were like, wow, this is really cool. But at the heart of it, and in subsequent work we did with a bunch of governments around the world, the Rwandans, Ugandans, Colombia, Dominican Republic, the Kuwaitis, etc. The crux of the issue comes down to the following. If you have a source of differentiation, and our mutual friend, Professor Otomi, talks a lot about this, the competitive advantage of a community, of a metropolitan area, can now be supported using a set of tools and resources that enable the investment to thrive. So the whole universe of cluster-driven economic planning comes to the fore. So if I take if you take almost any city or metropolitan area in Nigeria, the question then becomes is, what can that community do independent of the rest of the country to generate wealth? Is it in mining? Is it in producing plastic? Is it in producing ashoke or aqua ocha, as folks in Anyocha do, etc., etc., in Asaba? And so when you look at that, what we learned very quickly in that work was you needed to have a way to train people to think in that way. You need to provide resources to help essentially catalyze the investments, and you needed to have some mechanism of support available to them. And in almost every successful economy around the world, people use different terms. Some people call it economic development boards. Some people call it cluster strategy boards, etc., etc. You can call it any name, but the fundamental idea is, if you came into, I always revert back to Ibadan. If you came into Ibadan and said, what is Ibadan's competitive differentiation? And typically when we do this work, you actually want to talk to people. So you start with a town hall meeting. So you can see a situation where an Enterprise Nigeria team shows up and says, hey, our job is not to tell you what to invest in. Our job is to help you facilitate that process, put some capital behind it, and keep you honest, and basically drive you to deliver the work. So if we said Ibadan actually is geographically located such that it actually should be an education export center, then suddenly the city of Ibadan, with support from Oyo State, now decides they're going to build 100 schools, combination of kindergarten, secondary schools, universities, etc., and most of it in and around the Lagos-Ibadan Expressway, for example, that region where land is still free or relatively free, and you're also seeing a new GRA, the Rashid Ladoja GRA emerge there. And then that leads you to the next question, which is, what are the ingredients of success to be an education exporter to the rest of West Africa? So if you said, look, we don't want to tamper with high school, secondary school, primary, let's just focus on academic innovation platform, then you end up with maybe 3 or 4 institutions that are teaching things that are where there's a direct link to the workforce requirement. So we're not just producing certificate holders for the sake of it. We're saying 5 companies have come to Ibadan to do AI work or to do plastic molding. Our academic programs will be configured to support them, etc., etc. So you're supporting the training of talent, you're supporting the investment of those companies that have come to locate there, and you are also helping support them in terms of accessing market. That becomes the role of Enterprise Nigeria, is to be that champion and facilitator.
So Jude, you've just answered my question that this is really like NISA 2.0, right?
Yes.
I remember going down with you to someplace in Port Harcourt,
Yes.
at River State, where
Yes.
you ran this type of town hall meeting with, you know, farmers and so on. And under strong leadership like you provided in NISAL, yes, but we cannot design around that. You know, we've got to design around a reality that,
yes.
And I think it's what Thomas Sowell calls the conflict of visions, right? You know, the constrained and the unconstrained man, you know, basically saying that man will take advantage, you know, and that's a worldview, you know, that
Yes.
people will take advantage.
Mm-hmm.
And I think the core argument I'm trying to make is, instead of setting up these new bureaucracies from Abuja or wherever, just empower the local governments,
yes,
with the monies they're supposed to get today,
mm-hmm.
give them elections,
Mm-hmm.
and let the people decide for themselves. Let them decide what they want to do with their lives. And if they don't want to do anything meaningful with their lives, natural selection happens, you know. You know, so
yeah.
beyond setting up a new bureaucracy,
Yes.
do you agree or disagree with that point?
I know. So I'm ideologically neutral as to whether. So let me frame it this way. I would love to see that institutional evolution, but I'm also comfortable with the idea that we simply make the current system that we have today more efficient. So yes, the solution you described can work. And by the way, the idea of Enterprise Nigeria is the federal facing side of it in terms of support. I actually want every city to have its own equivalent that is essentially acting as a think tank for that city and saying, what can we do to produce wealth in this community? And then how can that wealth be reinvested in that community? So, and by the way, just from a success measuring point of view, we delivered on NISAL's intent, as the data would show. You know, NISAL we set up roughly about a decade ago, and today banks are lending over 11% of their loan portfolio to agriculture, from less than 1%. Now, half of what I spent my time doing the first year was just talking to bankers, convincing them that agriculture was a possibility where they could make money. So my boss, Lamido Sanusi, superb guy, did his part in bankers committee, browbeating every CEO to think about agriculture. Some banks embrace it more so better than others. I have to give credit to Sterling Bank, the old Sterling Bank. They were the ones that bought the first credit guarantee that NISAL wrote. And so Bukola, the head of the agri division then, I always say to everybody that she really is the ground breaking banker when it comes to agriculture in Nigeria, followed by Gudzamba at FCMB. So over time, other banks came along as they saw the results kind of beginning to pick up. And I always said to our clients, the banks, my goal at that time was to make NISAL obsolete. The day we did not have to sell a credit guarantee against an agricultural loan, that was the day I knew that our job was done, which is why we also wrote the MEMAT for a future where we became effectively like a private equity investor in agriculture. The guarantees were really a transition product to rebuild confidence in the system, and it worked. So today, people are investing in agriculture and doing well, except for the security problems we have, which is, you know, in the last 5-6 years. Now, if you think about the future, yes, you want every local government or city. So if we stay within our current constitutional framework, then yes, every governor should immediately call INEC and the state electoral commission, where they still have something along those lines, and say, we are going to organize elections. Any governor today who is continuing to appoint local government chairman and councillors is committing a crime against democracy, pure and simple. You are actually committing an illegality under the Constitution. Nobody should be appointed a councillor or chairman. Everyone should go through an electoral process that is reasonably transparent so that the community picks who it wants its leaders to be. And then exactly, to your point, those leaders now drive the dialogue to say, how can we generate wealth here? Part of the reason I also want the federal system, to go back to the point, dismantled is the monthly RefMac clown show. That's quite simply what it is, because you have no incentive to build wealth. If every month you fly to Abuja, you collect your allocation and you go home. No, the system is upside down. If I am the governor of Oyo State or Anambra State or Lagos State, I should, with the city mayor leaders, local government leaders, we should be talking about how do we invest in a trend we've seen so we can build cash flow and prosperity. Then we pay our taxes to the federal government and the wealth stays in our community. We should not be going to Abuja to collect money any month.
And I agree with you. I agree with you. And so if I go back to the tripod, so we've talked about localization or the local communities. We've touched on security, which I'm going to come back to.
Yes.
But I wanted to dwell a little bit on education, right?
Yes.
You talked about the education being an innovation, enabling education, but you also spent some time talking about reskilling of the Nigerian workforce, right?
Yes.
Especially at this point where it's even become more urgent, given the realities of AI and other related technologies.
Yes.
The question for me is, what's the ideal model for this reskilling? Yeah? Who will do what? Who will fund it? Is it a combination of government and private sector? How will it work in practice?
So maybe to start off with a premise. When back in the 1990s, a lot of folks remember the World Bank's publication, the Asian Miracle, and it caused a lot of hoopla in technocratic circles because the World Bank posited a theory as to how growth, essentially how wealth was created, and countries especially said no, things happen differently, etc. But prior to that, there's a great American historian, Chalmers Johnson, who talked about the flying geese model of how the Japanese transferred capabilities into Southeast Asia because the labor force costs had become excessive. And we're seeing a similar thing happening today where a lot of jobs are moving out of China, going to Vietnam, India, because labor is cheaper.
Correct.
That all presupposes an export growth-led model where you're producing iPhones and you're exporting to the rest of the world at the cheapest labor cost. Today, the world is more complex. You can still produce that iPhone, and that's actually, there's still an opportunity there. But we're also seeing that there's opportunity in exporting talent as itself. And I give credit to the current Honorable Minister of Trade, Industry and Investment for promoting NATEP, the Nigerian Talent Export Program, where effectively they're trying to legalize the whole process of talent going to international destinations. It's protected. The abuses that you saw in other places don't occur, and the income is official. But when you look at the rest of the economy, you then have to say, for us to pay for talent reskilling and to prepare for the future, how do we do it? So there are a couple of things. One is we have to go back and look at our regulations. And I think nothing crystallizes this better than the current battle between the nurses and the Nursing and Midwifery Council, where they're saying, look, in order for you to go abroad, you have to go through this certification process. Effectively, they're using administrative techniques to hold them back. And but you flip the question on itself and say, what if Nigeria actually produced 500,000 nurses instead of the 28,000? It's not like we don't have the people. We have the people who want to retrain as nurses. And I see a little bit of that light in the statement from government saying, oh, now we're going to move towards producing 120,000. The goal should not be a number. The goal should be to say, can we restructure our system to allow the market to drive where talent goes, and then using a combination of private sector and public monies, again, in a catalytic way, you use public money to catalyze and to de-risk, you should allow the system to retrain people. So if you cast your mind back to our GSM boom, again, one of the great things Olusegun Obasanjo achieved as president, he and Ernest Ndukwe and the leadership of NCC, one of the challenges they faced was there were not enough telecom or software engineers in the country. So a lot of that talent had to be imported. Now, if you do what the Singaporeans do, which is, scenario planning, it's something that we learned to do at Monitor and we've done for the Singaporeans and other countries. You kind of sit and say, where are the probable futures? So you can actually, it's not about, some people say, oh, this is CIA, you people are spying on us. No, it's pretty logical. You take a bunch of variables and say, if I put these on a 2x2, how will the world change? And you write a story about that. So if you said, for example, today, the crisis in the Gulf will continue and shipping in the Red Sea will continue to be attacked by the Houthis for the next 6 to 12 months, and shipping companies will get more and more nervous and more of their traffic will now come around West Africa. What future does that present you? It means when a ship goes from South Africa up to the coast of West Africa, it's roughly about 10 days of sailing. That means they have to refuel as they continue to North America. You as a coastal country can basically do what the Singaporeans did in the 1960s and 70s and say, we are going to deepen our ports, we are going to make bunker fuel available, we're going to improve our airport so that crew changes can happen. So that suddenly means crews of ships are flying into Lagos and they're spending 1 or 2 nights in a hotel before they join their vessel. It also means you are now selling food, water, and drinks to those ships. You're selling them bunker fuel at hundreds of dollars per ton to those ships, et cetera, et cetera. Literally, by raising your hand and saying, I am going to provide these services to the global shipping industry, you've invented jobs for Nigerians. You've invented jobs at the airport, at the ports, construction, in hospitality, et cetera, et cetera. So just put 1 or 2 more numbers on it. Your average tanker carries 22 crew members and steams at roughly about 20 to 40 knots, hence the timeline. And each person, and today most of those crews are either Filipinos or from other parts of the world. So in shipping, basically shipping's crewing follows global income standards. So there used to be a lot of Americans and Europeans on ships, they're long gone. Then there were the Russians, they didn't survive because of issues related to a bunch of factors, not excluding alcohol on vessels. Then there were the Koreans, the Chinese and the Indians stayed a bit, but as their countries got wealthier, they left and went back to shore. You have to ask the question, Africans are the logical nexus of crewing for global shipping, but what African country has actually taken the steps to build that capacity? And when I used to work in shipping, we've talked to a bunch of people all across the continent, but no one was prepared to take that advantage. Today, geopolitics has represented that opportunity. And I know that every major shipping company in the world usually runs about multiple ships. They're now rerouting them past the coast of West Africa. But there's no country today that has said, hey, I am going to reconfigure my maritime economy to create jobs.
So Jude, I hear you loud and clear, and we're going to open it up for audience questions and comments. But let me get one more question in, while they're ready their questions. You see, what you're describing, and you speak to this in the book, requires some kind of a whole of government approach, right?
Yes.
But we do not have any muscle memory as a people of having done anything approaching the level of complexity. And I call it complexity relative to what we've done. It's not that
Yes.
these things are complex to do,
Yes.
but relative to what we've done, right? In fact, if I look at Nigeria, the only really complex project that one can say we were successful deploying would be the LNG, the Nigeria liquefied natural gas, right? So if we don't have this muscle memory, if we've not been able to do these big things, if we can't even make our beds, if we can't do ordinary things, what gives you such a confidence that we can chase these relatively simple things, but complex and difficult for us? What gives you, what are the things that must be in place for us to be able to do this? And answer this question in light of this new regime in Nigeria that's coming from Nigeria's commercial center, where they've been able to do some things. What are the things that we should be expecting?
So fundamentally, if you set higher aspirations for yourself, you can deliver it. I'm a big fan of George W. Bush, Bush Jr., where he called it the soft tyranny of low expectations, if I remember the quote correctly. And that's really our problem today. We have a population approximately 230 million people, most of whom have incredibly low expectations, if non-existent expectations. So I asked a friend the other day, I said, do your children, have they ever experienced turning on a tap to get tap water and drank that water? And she was startled by the question and said, no, they've grown up drinking from pure water sachets all their life. And I said, you and I grew up together. I remember when we used to still turn on the tap, but I can also trace how public water disappeared from the University of Ibadan. And eventually, everybody started fetching water plus all sorts of things. I've always been of the view, set aside the political circumstances of our elections last year, which was incredibly unfortunate and absolutely crazy in many respects. But President Tinubu has to basically raise the level of the game and describe, I get it, things are challenging, but he has to come out and describe a future that is plausible and which he now says we are going to push ourselves harder. And it's doable. So when I was in some of my final years at Monitor, we did work for the CG of immigration. And each time I walk into Nigeria and I see that sign saying visa on arrival, I smile because that was the output of our work. But in order to prove that, we had to show the immigration service examples of work done in Kenya, in Rwanda, etc., and at some point it became, are you going to let those small Rwandans basically eclipse you in terms of the ease of entry into Nigeria? And because and what clinched it was to say, none of you have ever been on the opposite side of this conversation, which is going through a Nigerian visa application process. Exactly. If you did, you realize how absolutely crazy it is. So a lot of our problems are unforced errors where, yes, even if we change nothing about our constitutional structure, the president has to almost appoint a process where his ministers, he's basically lights a fire under them, and they have to work round the clock, hire as many consulting firms as you want, inject capacity into the system, but you need to be in constant problem-solving mode. So, I give you an example, doing some healthcare work for the government of Singapore just before COVID, part of, working with the director in the ministry, part of what they said to us was, if we fail at this work, we will basically attract not only penalties in the civil service, but the system would penalize us going forward. Today, it's not clear that there's any penalty for failure, but that's why the book starts by saying, let us paint a vision of what is possible. And then let us say to ourselves, let's go create the structures to actually get this done. And a lot of it is cleaning through our existing laws, our existing regulations, getting people into government whose first instinct is to do work as opposed to use government as a deal-making mechanism. So which is why the book also ends on what I call the post-Berlin idea, which is Nigeria actually should have merged into its neighbors. So Benin Republic, Niger, Cameroon, etc., we should all merge because these are natural communal and geographic economic clusters that do not need to be separated by artificial boundaries decided in the 19th century. Those communities should be together. And again, if President Tinubu gave a speech today saying, we are going to pursue this regional merger, and ahead of that regional merger, we're going to devolve more authority back in communities so that we are now modeling the behavior we want to see. And quite frankly, if you look at the way Benin Republic is run and Cotonou Port is run, I will hire Benin Republic's port administrators to run Nigeria's ports.
Correct.
It should be about merit and talent. I am violently opposed to federal character. It doesn't, because it's really that bigotry against people that we're simply perpetuating the idea that, oh, that part of the country is lazy. No good can come from. No, put everybody up, give them the chance to excel. So there should be equality of training, opportunity, and then let people compete. And if the post-Berlin Nigeria or Federated African Republic, as I call it, FAR, now wants to go far, it will use that challenge to drive performance beyond anyone's imagination.
When I read that part of the book, I was like, this book is not going to be a bestseller in West Africa. Because they already complained that we are too big a neighbor, and you're proposing almost an annexation. However, I understood what you were saying, which is create a broader market, and I think that's what the AFCFTA is trying to do with creating that common market. And again, the participants, please put your questions and comments in the chat room, and we'll give voice to it with appropriate attribution. But let's spend some time on the Safe Nigeria Act. The Act proposes about 1 million policemen on the streets, right?
Yes.
How would this work in practice? Again, bearing in mind my work avoidance question earlier on, right? What will you reform in the inefficient Nigeria police force and other security agencies, intelligence agencies, and how will this act be funded? The institutions and the practices, how will it be funded?
So I look at it this way, maybe beginning from the back end. Investment, targeted sound investment will generate its own profit margin. So if we invest in building, in improving security, I know for a fact and will guarantee it that GDP will grow much faster. It is a crime against every policy framework and against humanity for Nigeria's economy to be growing at sub 3%. It's just wrong because our population is growing at about 3%. So you're either progressively at a standstill or becoming poorer each year. So if our society is safe, people can, if effectively we're operating a 24/7 economy, it will generate sufficient tax revenue above and beyond our requirement to fund this. Now, forget what the IGs and various police panels have said over the years. Nigeria really does need about 1 million officers, even if just using the basic UN ratio of about 200, 250 officers to each person. That's where that number comes from. And if whether you put all of them into the MPF as it stands today, or you put them into a disaggregated system, which is what I would prefer, you need that because safety is the single most important factor to drive growth. So, one of the things that I point out to people about places like Rwanda, China, and Singapore, you can walk around those countries at any time of the day. You wouldn't see police officers, but they're there.
Yeah.
And there are cameras. and it's something the Chinese learned from the Singaporeans is, you will forget something. You forget your phone at a street market in Singapore or a street eating place. You come back 30 minutes later, an hour later, it's there. Prof talked about, he had a similar experience in Taiwan about 2 weeks ago. And that it comes from a network of intelligence gathering, of surveillance, of preventative policing, similar to what, as crazy as his reputation has become today, Rudy Giuliani, that was one of the great things he gave New York City. Build that CompStat system and make sure when you walk down the street, you see an NYPD officer around, and it creates reassurance. And that system over time pays for itself. So if you think about the billions of dollars that came into Times Square in the 1990s versus what Times Square looked like in the 1980s, the tax revenue from there paid for the incremental police, what do you call it, presence. And so my view is, yes, Nigeria is in a fiscal crisis today. It's improving slowly, but we can actually accelerate the rate of growth if we make certain quick choices. More police officers on the street, a better infrastructure, which again, despite all of these sins, it's the one thing we must give Muhammadu Buhari credit for, is he spent a lot of money on infrastructure, et cetera, et cetera, et cetera. That, and particularly like when you go back to Eastern Nigeria, to the point he made about poverty, that will help fix some of the issues, including the government of Nigeria respecting its own laws and stop disrespecting court rulings. You cannot expect stability and law and order if you are seen to be breaking them. So if the court says you should release a prisoner, do so, and then you can continue the process by legal process.
And I hear you loud and clear. And I think some of the state governments have started doing some work with looking for innovative ways of funding policing. So I know Lagos State started with the Security Trust Fund, and a number of other states have picked it up. What they may need to look at is, whilst the trust fund today looks like a CSO or grant, is there an investment component, where companies can invest in the trust fund and get a certain return on, the increased GDP or increased economic activities that happens within the state as a consequence of the monies that have been put in the fund? But
absolutely,
it
has to be arm's length. So but there is an implicit quid pro quo, which is we will help pay for security, but we're not looking for special favors for ourselves. We're looking for a large-scale safety impact.
But if there's some economic uptick, they should be able to get some share of that value.
Exactly.
So I've got a question here from Remy Adeshun. I hope I got that right. And the question is really about the pharmaceutical industry. It's struggling a bit, unless they get like single-digit interest rates, as we have, as we all claim in Nigeria, single-digit interest rate. They may not be able to survive. Her question, therefore, is NISA feasible still with the current CBN disposition? And if it were, could it be a solution for Nigeria's pharma sector?
So let me sort of step back on that single-digit interest rate religion.
Exactly.
I never believed it, but I understood why it needed to be done. Now, the fundamental issue is, so because of the abuses of that system, that's why Governor Cardoso and I think his team have reacted in a somewhat allergic manner to these non-monetary policy interventions. But we do recognize that interventions can be helpful. and which is where the Enterprise Nigeria idea comes from, that you want to write a set of policy regulations that incentivize behavior as opposed to transferring money directly to people where they think it's their piece of government largesse and they don't have to repay it. And that was the fundamental difference between agriculture and sectoral interventions under Sanusi versus under Godwin Emefiele. Because we had looked at the history of such interventions and came to the conclusion that it did not work. But if we used government money to accelerate what would be normal private investment decision, that makes a big difference. So for example, in pharmaceuticals, there are two things that can be done differently. One is, many years ago, the pharmaceutical industry in Nigeria was told by USAID, WHO, everybody, etc., that if you made certain quality investments to enable you to be pre-qualified for procurement locally, we will procure from you. And many Nigerian companies did. So they raised their quality standards, but the donors never came through. They did so a little bit in Ethiopia and in Kenya, but in Nigeria, they didn't. And so those guys were now stuck holding debt with the cash flows that were the premise of that borrowing not coming through, which leads you to the second potential lever is, can the government of Nigeria now do what the Ethiopians did and said, in procurement law, we will ascribe at least a 15% headroom to the Nigerian producer, such that if the foreign bidder says mine is 1 naira and the Nigerian producer says mine is 1 naira 15, the Nigerian producer will still get the contract. So in the end, and this was partly the direction of some of this executive order that's been discussed now, is you want to be able to drive Nigerian government procurement to support Nigerian enterprises rather than support foreign enterprises, but you have to do it in a way that doesn't violate our WTO commitments. So you cannot impose a ban on foreign imports, but you can put more levies and associated fees on top of the tariffs. And therefore you end up in giving incentive to the Nigerian side of the house. And you see this, there's big money on the table. So Nigeria spends roughly $250 to $400 million every year on pediatric vaccines. A lot of that ends up in India with the Serum Institute. And the question is, can we localize some of that spending? And whether it's in vaccines, oncology medicines, type 2 diabetes, heart failure medicines, etc. The first step is getting through past our own minds. And if we test Emzor or May and Baker's product and they meet the quality standards that we require, yes, let us start procuring from them rather than spending abroad, because that money has a domestic impact. But again, we have to be very careful how we frame that idea and how we implement it. So we're waiting to see the language of the executive order, but it does promise good things.
Excellent. So there's a question from Khadija Shuaibu. She's doing her National Youth Service Corps with us at Nextier. The question is, were there any personal experiences that influenced your perspectives on the topics discussed in the book? And I want to share one because I found it fascinating. You know, your story on how when you closed from school at international school, you would help your mom sell eggs within the university community, and how the university then shut down that business, and how that was your first lesson in how government interference works in society. I found that a very fascinating story. I wonder if there are other stories like that.
So it is true that one's personal experiences can shape one's ideological conviction. And I've jokingly said when people ask me this question, I said yes. The other thing was pensions. So the current the current contributory pension system basically, again, came from my experience with my mom when General Abdusalami Abubakar's government basically tried to lay off a whole bunch of public officials. So suddenly she was presented with a retirement letter, and then they did not, and she was happy to retire. But the system said, sorry, we don't have any money to pay you. And it was a woman who had been working since about 1979. This was 1999. And after, and that, the answer came when after OBJ had taken office. So I ended up, after multiple conversations with my mother, I went back to New York, sat down, and started writing this very angry letter, and explained her circumstances, and then said, by the way, I've been, I put on my consultant hat and I went and dug, and here's what I found. You have a massive problem. And at that time was roughly about a 4 trillion naira problem, which you can go back and look at the naira dollar exchange rate back then, and you get of the problem. And I said, you cannot afford this. Again, I've looked at the country's balance sheet. You have a real problem. Here's how I propose you solve it, and laid out a structure for them. And put the letter in the mail, tried to find an email address. There was no email address. So I literally addressed it to President Obasanjo State House, Abuja. Somehow, miraculously, the mail got delivered. And apparently, OBJ read it, gave it to Nasir El-Rufai, who talks about this in his book, The Accidental Public Servant. And then El-Rufai went to Atiku and said, this is crazy. And Atiku said, come, we have to go see OBJ. And then they were looking for me, and I changed jobs, and so I never worked on the direct work, but that memo became the basis of the current contributory pension system. So yes, the lesson I've learned is take your personal experiences and turn them out for the better. There are lots of Nigerians whose rights get violated every day, and they may not have a voice. In most cases, they don't have a voice. So if we see things that shape our conduct, yes, we should help fix it.
Thanks for that story, because it helps answer a number of questions I get all the time. People say, why do you write so much? Why do you organize, these discourses? No one's listening. Why bother? And I say to them, people are listening. It's working. You might not see it immediately, but it's working. But I guess it brings me to the next question from Obi Emekekwe, who I think is joining from London. He says, thank you very much for a very interesting and stimulating conversation. I worry, though, that discussions like this do not get to the real leadership in the country. What is the best approach to get the political leadership to listen and apply the outcomes of these discussions? So help answer this question.
in my fantasy moments, I had this when I saw the push to bring back the parliamentary system, and I said to my daughter, I said, I think I'm going to become Nigeria's next prime minister, because I get tired of talking to officials. I have tried to give advice to effectively every ruler of Nigeria, not necessarily leader, since Sani Abacha. And some people listen, other people don't listen. So a friend said to me once that you have this obsession with Nigeria, and you cannot seem to let go. You're always trying to fix Nigeria. And I said, yes, there's a value in doing so, because we all feel that swell of pride in our hearts when things are functioning, when Nigeria wins a cup, or you see a Nigerian now get appointed to some major position. But at the same time, you wonder, there's pain, because when I think of some of my classmates that I went to university with, we are now at that point where a number of them are senior American government officials, and I know exactly what they've done in terms of helping shape American society. And you also then look at Nigeria and say, I see so much talent that is sitting outside of Nigeria, and we cannot seem to fix the basic problems that we have. But as I said at the beginning, these are not rocket science problems. You have to keep pushing, but then someday, yes, we pray that we have that lucky break. But I take some measure of joy in the fact that even if we don't end up fixing everything, things happen in waves. So that was one of my senior partners at Monitor once wrote an article for CEOs, a strategy piece called "The Fast Pace of Slow Change." That the tipping point arrives sometimes when people least expect it, and then suddenly every piece of reform that people thought was not possible then just becomes the norm, and then we say to ourselves, why did we think this was not possible? So I think of Indonesia, where for a long time the army party Golkar ran Indonesia, and everybody thought Suharto was the only person who could run Indonesia, and democracy was a bad idea, etc., etc. And one day, boom, it all changes. Golkar stumbles along, and suddenly Indonesia is a very different place today. And when you think about it, Nigeria is actually a very different place today than Nigeria was in 1998.
Correct.
We've made a lot of progress, but there's some things we're still struggling with. And the fact that we're debating a return to parliamentary system, we've dismantled the electricity monopoly at multiple levels. We're slowly dismantling NNPC's monopoly, et cetera, et cetera. Now, the next wave of reform is to devolve power back to our local authorities, and then for people to now start thinking to themselves, hang on, I can fix this. And at the local community, once that ferment starts and people in Ubuluku start saying, we are going to become the aquaculture capital of Delta, or people in Gombe start saying, we are going to become the largest tomato growing and processing territory in Nigeria, and they start as a community investing against that idea, that's when the magic will begin.
Jude, 2 minutes to go. Let me get a question in from your namesake, Jude Uzonwanne.
Yes.
And the question is, it seems to me that the government has recognized that the floating of the Naira this time, or the time it was done, was a mistake. What remedies can they resort to stabilizing the strength of the Naira? So the first question is, was it a mistake to float? Then the second question is, what can they do? You've got about 1.5 minutes.
So unlike a lot of other folks, I don't think it was a mistake. I advocated for it. I wouldn't hide it. I think removing the petroleum subsidies was also not a mistake. Essentially, taking distortions out of the economy is not a mistake. Now, how do you cushion the effects? There's no other solution other than continuing to reform the economy. Some of this, you're not going to feel the effects of those reforms for months and years to come, but really stepping out of the way of the private sector in terms of not just wealth creation, but for real entrepreneurs to step up and start doing things. That's what will be the source of transformation. A lot of people, they don't give enough credit to the Nigerian diaspora for the stabilization role that dollar inflows play. So a lot of money, roughly about $25–30 billion, comes in from the diaspora every year, more so than foreign direct investment. Foreign direct investment has never exceeded 11 billion. And I'm sorry, 9 billion, and that was in 2011.
And I think it was down to like 1.82 billion a few years ago.
Last year was negative. It was 180 million left. So we are slowly taking charge of our own future. And as I said, the trick is to behave like the Singaporeans, which is look around us and say, where is there opportunity? And like the Japanese also, invent something out of nothing. I go back to that maritime opportunity. The world is having a problem. It represents an opportunity. Let's take it. Today, cocoa prices are off the charts. Are we planting more cocoa? In some places, yes. So my old friend, Ebenezer Bolowade, who is the commissioner of Agric in Ekiti, and he was one of the people who sat in many of those banker classes with NISA. Ebenezer is doing absolutely amazing work in Ekiti. But I don't see a lot of his other colleagues around the country doing similar work. So there's no substitute. The government can talk palliatives until it's blue in the face, but the only true long-term defense of the value of the Naira is a more productive, more entrepreneurial economy. And that means government changing regulations and allowing people to create wealth.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Jude. You see, the problem with this discussion is that we never have enough time to unpack everything, but we've got to bring it to a close. And I think we're closing on a note of the economy, which is going to be the next topic we deal with. In 2 weeks' time, April 3rd, same time, I'm going to have Dr. Tayo Aduloju, the Chief Executive of the Nigeria Economic Summit Group, join me to discuss how to grow the Nigerian economy. So please join us in 2 weeks' time. But Jude, thank you so much. And congratulations once more, for this book, The First Trillion. Yeah.
Thank you
very
much.
So much. Bye, everyone.
Thank you, everyone.